Welcome to Crimson Clues, where shadows hide secrets and silence reveals the truth. Every story is a puzzle, and every clue takes you closer to the answer. Subscribe now, join the hunt, and let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. The wheels of the train hummed a steady rhythm on the tracks as it rattled through the dreary countryside of England. Miss Jane Marple sat at the window, watching the autumn scenery as her knitting needles clicked softly. The air had the promise of rain, and the undulating hills, speckled with dwindling greens and golds, were covered in a light mist. Her keen eyes saw the ephemeral forms of distant church spires and hedgerows as she adjusted her shawl. Her objective was the community of St. Mary's Hollow, which she hadn't been to in years. However, it was quite vividly depicted in the letters of her old acquaintance, Lady Beatrix Hafford. Beatrice had written, "Such a quaint place, Jane," but it was not without its small dramas. Miss Marple gave a small smile. Charming villages, in her experience, were rarely as innocent as they seemed. The platform of St. Mary's Hollow appeared as the train slowed. A clump of ivy hanging to the ticket office, a neat little station with one bench. A gust of wind pulled at Miss Marple's bonnet as she picked up her plain luggage and stepped onto the platform. She was quickly helped by a young man in a tweed cap who was obviously the station porter. His eyes darted anxiously, but his voice was light as he inquired, "Miss Marple, is it? I was dispatched to get you by Lady Hafford." "My name is Tom Bryce." "Thank you, Tom," she said in a kind but incisive tone. "You seem a little strange. Is everything in the village going well?" With hesitation, Tom lifted her bag into a pony cart that was waiting. "Oh, lady, it's just the weather. Makes people tense." "And well," he said softly, "that artist up at Morningside Cottage is being discussed. People say Victor Langley is strange, but he keeps to himself." Miss Marple's brows raised a trifle. "Odd? How?" Tom climbed into the driver's seat and shrugged. "Miss, I'm not sure. Only tailies. They claim to paint nonstop and dislike guests. He may be concealing something up there, according to some." The cart trudged past thatched homes and stone walls into a narrow path. In front of her, St. Mary's Hollow opened up. A bar, a post office, and a church with an uneven steeple encircle a green in this picture-perfect hamlet. However, the community seemed to be holding its breath because of the tension and silence in the air. Miss Marple saw the flitting curtains and windows and the fleeting looks of people walking by. At the outskirts of the village stood Lady Beatrix's house, Hafford Hall, a Georgian manor with a gravel road and walls covered in ivy. Miss Marple was met at the door by Beatrice herself, a sprightly woman in her 60s who had a taste for lavender silk. Beatrice cried out, "Jane, my dear," and clasped her hands. "Nothing has changed about you. Come on, you must be completely cold. There is tea waiting." With a silver tea service shining on a mahogany table and a roaring fire, the drawing room was cozy. With her eyes sparkling with gossip, Beatrice leaned forward as they sat down with their cups. "Though it has its quirks, Jane, you'll find St. Mary's Hollow to be charming. For example, Morningside Cottage up on the hill is home to Victor Langley. Not a friend, but a recluse. Regarding him, the villagers have strong opinions." Miss Marple sipped her tea with a calm face, but a sharp intellect. "Split? How so?" Beatrice remarked, "Some consider him a genius, while others view him as a threat. The matriarch of the Grayson family is Mrs. Grayson. He's a shame, according to old money, for painting those contemporary works. However, the schoolteacher, young Clarabelle, claims he is misinterpreted. Then there is Dr. Harrov, who has given him one treatment but will not discuss it. Oh, and Mr. Petton, the vicar, says Victor's immoral behavior is a negative effect." Miss Marple's needles made a steady clicking sound. "A man must be fascinating if he arouses such strong feelings. Is anyone familiar with his paintings?" "Hardly," said Beatrice. "Even though Clara claims to have seen one once, he keeps his studio shut." She believed it was a portrait, but it made her tremble. Thoughts of Morningside Cottage lingered in Miss Marple's mind when the topic veered to village life. She had previously seen reclusive, secretive guys like Victor Langley, who might have been troubled by a past they wanted to forget. Such men, in her experience, frequently drew trouble, or worse, solicited it. The rain started to patter against the windows as nightfall approached, and the fire became dimmer. Miss Marple was left alone with her thoughts when Beatrice excused herself to talk to the housekeeper. She looked out at Morningside Cottage, silhouetted against the stormy sky on the darkening hill. In one window, a light flickered, fleeting and shaky like a candle caught in a draught. Miss Marple paused her needles and muttered, "Odd indeed. And in my experience, strangeness frequently results in something sinister. Where in the world are you working on mysteries with us, detective, before we go on? In the comments, include your location. Click subscribe if you want to read more twisted stories. The case file for tomorrow is even more bleak. Remain alert." Chapter 2. The Hilltop Cottage. By the next evening, St. Mary's Hollow was covered in a gentle veil as the rain had subsided into a constant drizzle. Lady Beatrix Hefford had prepared a quiet dinner to welcome her friend, and Miss Jane Marple sat in the dining room of Hefford Hall wearing her favorite brooch and a sensible navy frog. Under the chandelier, the polished silver and crystal on the long wood table glinted. Nevertheless, a sense of disquiet permeated the gathered visitors despite the room's warmth, and Miss Marple's keen eyes picked it up. Beatrice had invited a few people from the village, all of whom were significant figures in St. Mary's Hollow's fabric. Mrs. Elenina Grayson sat at Miss Marple's right, a strong woman in her 50s. Her rigid stance and pearl necklace announced her position as the leader of the Grayson household. The young schoolteacher Clara Bell was across from her. Her anxious grin and bright eyes revealed a mind that was both inquisitive and wary. Clara was seated next to the town doctor, Dr. Harold Hargrove, who avoided making direct eye contact while fumbling with his serviette. Before the supper began, the vicar, Mr. Arthur Petton, a slender man with a constantly anxious face, said grace from the far end. As always the charming hostess, Beatrice led the conversation with ease. She passed a plate of roast pheasant and remarked, "Jane, you must hear about the peculiarities of our little village. For example, a cottage by the morning. Thanks to Mr. Langley, it's the talk of St. Mary's Hollow." Mrs. Grayson's mouth clenched. Her voice was as cutting as cut glass as she said, "That man is a disgrace, painting those monstrosities while living as a recluse. This land has been owned by the Graysons for many centuries, and I refuse to allow such a person to ruin our village." With a pleasant look, Miss Marple cocked her head. "Mrs. Grayson, you've seen his paintings." "Not personally," Mrs. Grayson said, blushing slightly. "However, according to my son Rort, they are outrageous. At the cottage, he saw a hideous creature with eyes and shadows. Tradition is unimportant to Victor Langley." With a firm yet gentle voice, Clarabelle put down her fork. "Mrs. Grayson, I believe you're being too harsh on him. Yes, Mr. Langley's art is unique, but it has a lot of impact. Once, while delivering books to the cottage, I noticed a sketch. I believe it was a portrait of a woman. It was sad, but not scandalous. Sad." Dr. Harov interrupted in a sudden tone. As though he regretted his outburst, he cleared his throat. "To put it another way, isn't art subjective? There's no need to fuss." He twisted the stem of his wine glass with his fingers. Miss Marple also observed a slight tremble in his hand. Mr. Petton, the victor, leaned forward and spoke in a low, serious voice. "I worry that Mr. Langley's seclusion may be a spiritual issue. You know, a man who blocks out the world so totally has turned me down on visits. It does, however, imply a troubled soul." Miss Marple's gaze darted from face to face as she sipped her wine. How a reclusive individual can evoke such intense emotions is interesting, isn't it? What is he hiding, or maybe what is he hiding from? There was a brief silence at the table. The rain pattering against the glass was the only sound. Beatrice chuckled lightly, feeling the tension. "Jane, you're going to make us all distrust one another next. Let's talk about nice stuff. Tell us about the children's pageant, Clara." Miss Marple's gaze remained on the others as Clara brightened and began to tell a story about her students. Mischievous behavior, Mr. Petton's worried forehead, Mrs. Grayson's stiff stance, and Dr. Harrow's nervous looks all revealed a private discussion. Beatrice had indicated that Rebert Grayson was delayed due to business in London, but he was not present. It seems that the young man had deep feelings regarding Victor Langley. Miss Marple excused herself to the veranda during the lunch, stating that she needed some fresh air, as the visitors adjourned to the drawing room for coffee. A lone light was glowing in the window of Morningside Cottage, which stood on its hill in the distance. The night was calm, the rain was a gentle murmur. She remembered what Tom Bryce had said at the station. "He's allegedly concealing something up there." Putting a shawl around her shoulders, Beatrice joined her. "Jane, you're so silent. We are already baffled by the mysteries of our village." With her gaze fixed on the cottage, Miss Marple grinned. "Oh, Beatrice, I was just thinking. A man who sparks such conversation, brilliance, or terror, whether he is adored or despised, rarely leads a tranquil life for very long, in my experience." A burst of wind shook the windows as they made their way back to the drawing room, and Miss Marple felt a twinge of discomfort. Morningside Cottage and the guy living there seemed to her like the initial strand of a much bigger web, which she was resolved to untangle. Chapter 3. A Nighttime Cry. By the third night of Miss Marple's stay in St. Mary's Hollow, the rain had intensified, pounding relentlessly on Hafford Hall's roof. A tiny fire flickered shadows across the wallpaper as Miss Jane Marple sat in her guest room. As she listened to the storm, crocheting idly in her lap, her mind drifting back to the Hafford Hall dinner and the undercurrents she had detected among the guests. Clara Bell's defense of Victor Langley, Dr. Harrow's discomfort, and Mrs. Grayson's contempt were all parts of an unfinished puzzle. The silence was broken by a sharp scream that cut through the rain's pounding. Miss Marple's needles fell to the ground as her head jerked up. The sound, brief and harsh, had been carried away by the wind from outside. Pulling her shawl across her shoulders, she stood up and walked to the window. With the exception of a dim glow in one window that had since gone out, the hill where Morningside Cottage stood was completely dark. Footsteps resounded in the hall a few moments later, and Lady Beatrice, with her face white under her lace cap, emerged at the door. "Have you heard that, Jane?" A terrible sound. Surely it came from the village, or perhaps the hill. Miss Marple, her eyes narrowing, murmured gently. "Beatrice, we'd better find out. Get your coat." Despite the rain, a small group of people had collected by the time they arrived at the village green. Unsettling pools of light were created on damp cobblestones by lanterns that bobbed in the shadows. The porter, Tom Bryce, was standing at the edge, looking pale. When he saw Miss Marple, he remarked, "It's Morningside Cottage." "Mom!" It was heard by Clara Bell. She says, a scream, as she passes by on her way home. To get Constable Reed, she ran. Clarabelle was standing close by, her eyes wide with fear and her coat drenched. Stuttering, "I didn't see anything," she said. "I heard it horribly, like if someone were in agony. No one answered when I knocked. There was a lock on the door. Dr. Harrow arrived with Constable Reed, a stout man with a walrus mustache. That's what Reed said sternly. Let's have a peek. You'd better come along in case someone gets wounded, Dr. Hargrove." As discreet as ever, Miss Marple trailed the group up the muddy path to Morningside Cottage. The windows of the little stone home were dark and unwelcoming as it loomed against the stormy sky. A side window had been left open, its latch hanging loosely, but the hefty oak front door was closed. Tom, holding a lantern, and Dr. Harrow followed after Constable Reed, shoved it open and climbed through. The cottage smelt like damp wood and turpentine. A lone armchair and a messy table with paintbrushes and jars were the only furnishings in the parlor. The studio was located on the upper floor, accessible via a narrow stairway. Miss Marple hovered in the parlor, seeing a broken teacup on the table, without its saucer and a subtle, unidentifiable bitter taste. The voice of Constable Reed roared up here. With Miss Marple moving with unexpected agility for her age, the gang rushed upstairs. They discovered Victor Langley in the studio, a disorganized area crammed with easels and canvases. His head was cocked back, his eyes were staring blankly at the ceiling, and he was slumped in a chair by an incomplete painting. A tiny glass vial was broken on the floor next to him, and he held a paintbrush in his stiff hand. A bitter, almond-like tang permeated the air, tightening Dr. Harrow's face. The doctor, who was kneeling next to the body, said grimly, "Poison. I bet the stench was cyanide. He's probably been dead for an hour or two." Constable Reed gave his head a scratch. There was a lock on the door. The window is just barely open. No indication of a fight. How can poison enter a room that is locked? Miss Marple's gaze wandered about the studio. The easel-mounted canvas showed a stormy sea with waves painted in rough gray and blue strokes. On a nearby table, a sketchbook was open, but one page had been ripped out, leaving a jagged edge. She leaned nearer, her fingers grazing the slightly sticky surface of the table. Curious, she practically whispered to herself. A man alone, yet not alone enough to escape death. Clara Bell suppressed a sob as she stood in the doorway. He was very private. Who would act in this way? But that's exactly what we need to find out about Miss Marple, her soft yet firm voice. As Constable Reed sent for the coroner and the rain continued to fall, Miss Marple stepped back, her mind already sifting through the fragments of the scene. The locked door, the broken vial, the missing sketch, and that faint lingering smell, St. Mary's Hollow it seemed, had a secret it was no longer willing to keep. Chapter 4. The Puzzle of the Locked Room. It was gray and rainy as the morning after Victor Langley's passing broke, and the rain continued to drum against Hefford Hall's windows. As Lady Beatrice described the village's response to the tragedy, Miss Jane Marple sat in the breakfast room, her tea cooling. St. Mary's Hollow was a hive of curiosity as word of the artist's passing spread like wildfire. However, Miss Marple's mind was focused on Morningside Cottage, where a broken vial and a locked door raised issues that needed to be answered. In order to provide a female viewpoint on the situation, Constable Reed had allowed Miss Marple to return to the cottage with him and Dr. Harrow. In actuality, Reed appeared to be out of his element, and even this peaceful region of England had heard of Miss Marple's reputation for seeing what others overlooked. Miss Marple observed the cottage's seclusion as they struggled up the hill, the mud sticking to their feet, distant enough from the hamlet to deter casual visitors, yet close enough to be observed. The slight bitter tang of cyanide was still there in the air within the studio. The chair where Victor Langley had sat was still there, its tattered upholstery sprinkled with paint flecks, but his corpse had been taken away. Like a silent observer, the canvas on the easel appeared to guard the space with its raging sea. Miss Marple's gaze traveled slowly, absorbing everything. The sketchbook with its missing page, the small overturned stool by the window, its legs scuffed as if kicked away, and the chipped teacup from the parlor below, now joined by its saucer on a shelf. Constable Reed frowned at the locked door and stroked his mustache. "Miss Marple, it's a right puzzle. The door bolted from within. A man couldn't fit through the window without a racket. But there's that cyanide vial. According to Dr. Harrow, how'd it get here?" Standing behind the easel, Dr. Harrow shuffled uneasily. "Although it's uncommon, I have witnessed cyanide being utilized in medical practice. Perhaps it was in his paints. Although it's risky, some artists utilize it for pigments." He drifted off, rubbing his fingers on his medical bag, but that fragrance. Miss Marple placed her handkerchief to her nose and knelt over the broken vial. The pieces of glass gleamed on the floor, and the wood underneath was faintly stained. "Interesting," she murmured quietly. "Even though the vial is broken, the liquid appears to have spilt in a certain manner, almost as if it was dropped on purpose." Reed purposefully blinked at her. "You mean it was staged?" "I mean," Miss Marple stated in a gentle tone, "that we need to take into account every possibility. It's not always true that a sealed room is safe." She stood up straight and looked at the window. Despite being loose, the corroded lock indicated that it had not been opened for years. However, the sill was dust-free, as though it had just been moved. She looked across to Dr. Harrov. "I think you once treated Mr. Langley. Did he ever say anything out of the ordinary concerning his habits or his health?" Harrov busied himself with his bag as his face tensed. "Just once for a little illness. He kept to himself. Said very little. Just complained of headaches." Miss Marple took note of the way his eyes darted to the sketchbook and back again. She walked over to the sketchbook and turned the pages. The drawings featured angular cliffs, faces partially obscured by shadow, and dramatic, almost eerie settings. She looked at the ripped edge where a page was missing. What was so important about this sketch that it had to be removed? She whispered. Constable Reed let out a sigh. It might have been Langley cleaning up himself. Artists are strange people. Maybe, Miss Marple responded with a little smile. However, in my experience, removals are frequently made for a reason. Miss Marple lingered on the path as they left the cottage, her gaze following the muddy ground. From the window to a group of shrubs, there was a weak trail that was almost discernible in the soggy ground. She didn't say anything, but the detail, the scuffed stool, the sharp odor, and Dr. Harrov's discomfort were all noted in her thoughts. She believed that Morningside Cottage had more mysteries than most in St. Mary's Hollow, which was a village full with secrets. Beatrice welcomed them back to Hefford Hall with a freshly brewed pot of tea. "Well, any theories, Jane?" "There is a frenzy throughout the village. Clarabelle claims Victor was too obstinate to commit suicide, despite Mrs. Grayson's insistence that it was suicide." Miss Marple took a chair, and her knitting resumed its rhythmic cadence. "Beatrice, murder or suicide? I'm sure Morningside Cottage has a few more details to give before we're done, because the truth is in the details." Chapter 5. Historical Whispers. By lunchtime, the rain had subsided to a light mist, casting a shimmering haze over St. Mary's Hollow. With her umbrella slung over her shoulder, Miss Jane Marple headed for the Hamlet Post Office, a small store that served as the hub of local rumors. People were talking about the murder at Morningside Cottage, and Miss Marple was aware that in a village like this, the truth was frequently concealed in the rumors that were passed back and forth across garden fences and countertops. The postmistress, Mrs. Tilley, was a large woman who liked to stop dramatically. Miss Marple directed the conversation toward Victor Langley while she bought some stamps. She said, "A terrible business, Mrs. Tilley," in a soft voice. "Did you know Mr. Langley well?" Mrs. Till was so excited to be consulted that her eyes glistened. "I saw plenty, but not well, miss. Always in a rush, he would come in for his letters, not many, mind you. As if he didn't want to be noticed, he kept his coat collar up. Sort of queer, in my opinion." "In what sense is it queer?" As she adjusted her gloves, Miss Marple inquired. Mrs. Tilley dropped her voice and leaned forward. "Unexpectedly arrived in the village 5 years ago. I heard from Mrs. Baxter, but he claimed to be from London. She is the wife of the butcher. That he had been somewhere, perhaps Paris, fleeing something, she thought. More like a woman." Miss Marple's brows raised a trifle. "A female?" "How fascinating," Mrs. Baxter continued. Mrs. Tilley's tone implied different, but she responded, "Oh, just title. A broken engagement from years ago, perhaps. They believe that a lady of class made him bitter and ruined his heart. With the exception of Clarabelle, who would bring him books, He never interacted with others here, in my opinion. What about the Graysons? Yes, they hated him. Miss Marple nodded and put the information away. You mean the Graysons? Mrs. Grayson and I had dinner together. She seems to have strong beliefs. Mrs. Tilly gave a snort. Ella Lenina Grayson believes that St. Mary's Hollow is hers. Robert, her son, felt worst about Langley. Here in the shop, I once called him a scammer. Claimed that those paintings were offensive to good people. Note that Robert hasn't heard the news yet because he has been in London lately. Miss Marple thought about the shards of rumor as she walked out of the post office. An unsolved engagement, an enigmatic past, and the animosity between the Graysons. She was able to pluck threads out of the tangle. She made the decision to go meet Clara Bell, who had appeared to be both moved by Victor's passing and sympathetic to him. Despite the melancholy, Clara lived in a neat cottage close to the schoolhouse, with a garden full of late-blooming airs. In a salon filled with books and watercolor drawings, she smiled nervously as she offered tea to Miss Marple. As she poured from a broken teacup, Clara said, "I still can't believe it." Victor was quite lively. For him, his work was everything. Observing the shaking of Clara's hands, Miss Marple took a drink of her tea. "Didn't you like his artwork? You spoke of a portrait that really caught your attention. Could you elaborate?" Clara paused, her gaze darting to a drawing on the wall. The village green is depicted delicately. It was the half-finished face of a lady. She had such sad, almost frightening eyes. Although Victor refused to discuss it, I had the impression that it held some significance for him. I didn't press because he became irritated when I inquired. "Interesting," observed Miss Marple quietly. "Did he ever talk about his past? Maybe it was a woman or a reason he visited St. Mary's Hollow." Clara gave a head shake. He was reticent, but once he remarked something strange when I handed him a book about French artists. He remarked, "Paris breaks more than it builds," and his face darkened. I didn't dare ask more. The mist had grown thicker, snaking like eerie fingers over the hedge as Miss Marple left Clara's cottage. She stopped in the churchyard, where the vicar, Mr. Petton, was caring for a rose bush. His normally pale face was flushed with anger. "Miss Marple, good day, Mr. Petton," she called. "A sad time for the village, is it not?" He brushed dirt from his hands and straightened. "Miss Marple, I'm quite sad. Mr. Langley was unresponsive when I attempted to contact him to offer advice. I dread that a man adrift, and now this tragedy." There was a slight glint in Miss Marple's eyes. "Say, adrift? Did he ever make any indication of his problems?" Petton scowled. He once stayed outside after a service and murmured something about sins coming full circle. I considered that unusual, but he went off before I could ask further. A lost love in Paris, a conflict with the Graysons, a haunting photograph, and lingering sins were all in Miss Marple's mind as she walked back to Hefford Hall. Miss Marple believed that Victor Langley's background contained the secret to his demise, casting a shadow over St. Mary's Hollow. Soft and persistent, the rain started to pour once more, perhaps pressing her to discover the truth before a new storm erupted. Chapter 6. The Artist's Secret. The rain had paused, leaving St. Mary's Hollow draped in a damp silvery stillness. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella at the ready, walked the path to Morningside Cottage once more, having persuaded Constable Reed to allow her another look at the studio. "Just to clarify a few details," she had said, her mild tone masking the sharp curiosity that drove her. The constable, harried by paperwork and village gossip, had agreed, provided she touched nothing. Inside the cottage, the air was heavy with the lingering sense of turpentine and cyanide. Miss Marple climbed the narrow stairs to the studio, her steps deliberate, her eyes scanning for what others might have overlooked. The room was much as she had last seen it, the stormy canvas on the easel, the scuffed stool, the sketchbook with its torn page. But today her attention was drawn to a wooden chest tucked beneath a cluttered table, its lock scratched as if recently forced. Kneeling with care, Miss Marple opened the chest, revealing a stack of sketches bound in twine. The drawings were striking, angular faces, twisted landscapes, and one recurring image. A woman with mournful eyes, her features rendered with both precision and pain. The same face Clarabelle had described, Miss Marple noted, and strikingly similar to a photograph she glimpsed in Clarara's parlor, though she couldn't yet place why. One sketch, tucked at the bottom, was different. A caricature of a grand house, unmistakably Grayson Manor, with a shadowy figure lurking at its gates. The figure's face was scratched out, the pencil marks violent. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers tracing the paper's edge. "What secrets you kept, Mr. Langley?" She replaced the sketches, memorizing their details, and made her way to the village pub, the Rusty Anchor, where the evening crowd gathered to dissect the murder. The pub was a low-ceiling room, its air thick with pipe smoke and the tang of ale. Miss Marple settled in a corner, her knitting in hand, appearing as inconspicuous as a sparrow. Yet her ears caught every word. At the bar, Tom Bryce, the porter, was deep in conversation with Robert Grayson, who had returned from London that morning. Robert, a tall man in his 30s with sharp features and a restless energy, slammed his tankard down. Langley was a blight on this village, he declared, his voice carrying, painting his nonsense, stirring up trouble. "Good riddance, I say." Tom glanced around nervously. "Careful, Mr. Grayson. Folk'll think you had a hand in it." Rourke's laugh was harsh. "Me? I was in London when he died. Ask anyone. Besides, why bother with a man already ruining himself?" Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, but her eyes flicked to Robert's hands, clenched with a faint smudge of ink on one finger. Curious, she thought, for a man who claimed to despise art. Across the room, Clarabelle sat with Dr. Harriv, her face pale. The doctor's voice was low. "Urgent, Clarara, you mustn't speak of his sketches. It'll only cause trouble." "But they meant something," Clarara insisted, her voice trembling. "That woman in them, she was real, wasn't she?" Dr. Harriv's reply was cut off by the pub door swinging open, admitting Mrs. Grayson, her face a mask of disapproval. "Robert, you're making a spectacle," she snapped, striding to her son. "And you, Miss Bell, ought to mind your tongue about that man's filthy drawings." Clarara flushed but held her ground. "They weren't filthy. They were personal. Maybe if you'd known him enough." Mrs. Grayson's voice was ice. "The Grayson have no interest in that man's sordid past." She seized Robert's arms, steering him toward the door, but not before Miss Marple caught the flicker of fear in her eyes. As the pub settled, Miss Marple approached Clarara, her smile gentle. "My dear, those sketches. Did you ever see one of a house? Perhaps Grayson Manor." Clarara hesitated, then nodded. Once it was unsettling, like he was mocking them, but there was something angry about it. "I didn't understand why." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've been most helpful, Clarara. Sometimes anger on paper speaks louder than words." As she left the pub, the mist had returned, curling around the lampposts. The sketches, the confrontation, Root's ink-stained fingers, it all pointed to a scandal buried deep, one that tied Victor Langley to the Graysons in ways yet unclear. Miss Marple glanced toward Grayson Manor, its lights faint in the distance. "A house with secrets," she murmured, "and a family determined to keep them." Chapter 7. Envy's Shadow. As though the community wanted to dispel the darkness of Victor Langley's passing, the annual village festival in St. Mary's Hollow went forward in spite of the rain. Stalls offering hot cider, knitted scarves, and jams filled the green. As children ran among the people, their laughter a vivid contrast to the gloomy sky. Wrapped in a woolen coat and wearing her sensible cap, Miss Jane Marple walked among the guests, her eyes piercing behind her gentle smile. She was aware that a village fete served as a venue for both revelry and secrets. They stopped at a booth where Clara Bell was exhibiting her students' drawings after Lady Beatrice Hafford requested that Miss Marple accompany her to the wedding. With her customary brightness diminished, Clara's face looked drawn. She pointed at the joyous scene and said, "Miss Marple, it feels wrong, doesn't it? Victor's gone, and here we are, pretending all's well." Miss Marple gave her a pat on the arm. "Grief takes its own time, my dear, but people do talk at such events, and talk can be illuminating." Robert Grayson showed up as if at the last second, his fitted coat soaked with the fog. He was engaged in discussion with Tom Bryce, the porter, whose anxious glances implied uneasiness. With her knitting bag hanging softly by her side, Miss Marple stepped closer. "You're sure you saw me at the station?" Rurt was speaking in a low, demanding voice. "Tom, that evening. It's crucial." Tom's cap twisted in his hands as he moved. "I believe that, Mr. Grayson. It was raining hard and it was late." "But what?" "I saw someone get aboard the London train." Robert's face darkened as he snapped. "Sir, it was dark. Anyone wearing a coat like yours could have been the culprit." Rurt frowned as Tom's remarks trailed off, and he rushed off to assist a customer. Her hands were quiet, but she could hear the faint click of Miss Marple's needles in her thoughts. Robert's claim to have been in London on the night of the murder was not as solid as he had made it out to be. She ignored the observation and turned to face Mrs. Grayson, who was standing close to the church tent with a serious expression on her face. Dr. Hargrove was standing next to her, talking animatedly and making angular movements. Before they could finish speaking, Miss Marple heard the phrases "reckless" and "repute." Mrs. Tilly waved a letter in the air during a hubbub at the post office stall, interrupting the fete. "Found it in the sorting tray," she said proudly. "Though it was addressed to Mr. Langley, it never made it to him. Must have been delivered the day he you know." With his mustache twitching, Constable Reed, who was there to maintain order, accepted the letter. "Mrs. Tilly, I'll keep this. It might be proof." Yet Miss Marple, who was standing close by, caught a glimpse of the envelope. There was a slight smudge of ink on the flap. The handwriting was exquisite but hasty, and there was no return address. "May I see it, Constable?" With a different tone, she inquired. After a moment of hesitation and a mumble about citizen interference, Reed gave it over. Miss Marple noted the weight of the envelope as she twisted it in her hands. "Unopened," she murmured quietly. "Strange that it came too late." That night, Miss Marple sat by the fire in Hafford Hall, the letter unfolded in front of her, now opened with Reed's consent. Written in the same graceful style, it was brief. "You can't hide forever, Victor. I'll see that the truth is revealed." Miss Marple narrowed her eyes and said, "Evelina Grayson or someone else who hasn't been identified." The tone of the letter was confrontational, even menacing, but it was frustratingly ambiguous. Dr. Harrow's anxiousness at the F8, Clara's haunted face, and Robert's collapsing alibi all crossed her mind. She suspected that the root of this mess was envy. Envy connected to Victor's work, his history, or maybe something more profound. With a hint of gossip on her face, Beatrice came in. "You won't guess, Jane. A week before the murder, Robert Grayson was spotted arguing with Victor outside the cottage." Tom Bryce heard a reference to overdue debts. "This letter comes next. Do you believe there is a connection?" With a little smile, Miss Marple folded the letter. "If you look closely enough, Beatrice, everything is connected. And I have a suspicion that this letter is just one strand in a complex web." As the rain resumed its soft patter against the windows, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the sketches in Victor's chest, the scratched-out figure at Grayson Manor, and the shadow of envy that appeared to hang over St. Mary's Hollow. She sensed the truth approaching, like a figure rising out of the fog, and realized that the destiny had revealed more than its organizers had meant. Rain and discoveries in Chapter 8. That nightfall, thunder rolled across the hills and rain lashed the windows of Hafford Hall as the storm that had threatened St. Mary's Hollow for days came roaring to life. Sitting in the drawing room, Miss Jane Marple's crocheting provided a gentle diversion from the storm outside. Lady Beatrice was pacing around the fire, restless. The village's mounting anxiety about Victor Langley's murder dimmed her former joy. She looked out at the flood and remarked, "It's as if the weather itself is against us." "Jane, no one's talking of anything but that wretched cottage." There was a slight glint in Miss Marple's eyes. "Beatrice and Storm have a way of making things tense. Includes secrets." When Constable Reed showed there with his oilskin coat leaking down the carpets, her statements turned out to be prophetic. With a moist mustache, he added, "Please pardon me, Lady Hefford. I figured you'd want to know, Miss Marple. At Morningside Cottage, we discovered something. Thought you may." "Okay, look." Miss Marple, intrigued, pulled on her coat and trailed behind Reed into the storm, her umbrella flimsy against the wind. Even though the road to Morningside Cottage was a maze, Miss Marple moved steadily and kept her head up. Reed took her to the parlor of the cottage, where a lantern lighted a new discovery: a slightly smudged footprint of mud at the side window. It was tiny, nearly fragile, and pressed into the flooring like someone had just come in from a night of rain. "Found it this afternoon," Reed remarked while rubbing his eyebrows. "Have you missed it before? Why do you have so much to do? I bet it doesn't match any man's boots, let alone Langley's. Too little." Miss Marple traced the edge of the footprints while kneeling and covering her fingers with her handkerchief. "Maybe a woman's shoe," she whispered. "Or a man whose feet are unusually little. And notice that instead of the path's brown mud, there's a hint of red clay. Wondering, don't you?" Reed scowled. "No one's around here, Clay. Not unless you visit Grayson Manor's ancient quarry." Miss Marple's face stayed calm, but the detail was noted in her thoughts. She walked over to the window, observing that the latch was loose and that there was no dust on the sill. "This window," she said, "was it open when you first arrived, Constable? Cracked?" Reed said, "Yes, but I believed it was too narrow for anyone to climb through." "Perhaps," murmured Miss Marple in a kind voice. "However, a key may fit through a little opening." On the wall, she indicated a small metal hook that was empty, but had the faint outline of a key in the dust. Was a key previously present here? Reed's gaze expanded. "You bring it up now, but there was. However, the spare for the front door has vanished. Thought Langley misplaced it." Miss Marple kept looking at the hook. A window just ajar, a footprint from foreign clay, and a stolen key. The picture was still elusive, but the pieces were starting to fit together. The hill was momentarily illuminated by lightning as the storm continued to rage as they exited the cottage. When Miss Marple saw a sparkle in the bushes close to the path, a piece of metal partially buried in the mud, she stopped. She bent down and took out a tiny carved key. Its surface is intact but tarnished. She raised it and said, "Constable, we found what was lost, I think." Warm from the warmth, Miss Marple studied the key beneath a lamp back at Hereford Hall. In contrast to the cottage's basic locks, its elaborate appearance suggested it belonged somewhere else. Maybe Grayson Manor, with its abundance of red clay. She remembered Rurt's flimsy alibi, the mysterious letter signed E, and Clarara's reference to the eerie drawing of the manor. The pattern was still unclear, but the threads were weaving together. Hovering close by, Beatrice let out a gasp at the key. "Where did you find that, Jane?" "One of the Graysons, it appears. They have numerous ancient keys to their property." "Does it now?" Softly, Miss Marple said. "Then it could be time for us to visit Grayson Manor. Secrets, it's easy for Beatrice to blend in, especially in a house that ancient." Miss Marple's mind shifted to the key, the footprint, and the unfit clay while the storm rumbled outside. The Morningside Cottage murder was no longer a mystery. It was a story of treachery. She was also resolved to read its last chapter, 9, The Legacy of Grayson. St. Mary's Hollow was shrouded in a gloomy mist as the rain had turned into a steady drizzle. Lady Beatrix Hafford, who had insisted on accompanying her, strolled with Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella slanted against the wind, along the gravel path to Grayson Manor, a reminder of the Grayson family's centuries-old authority in the community. The house loomed ahead with its stern and towering stone exterior, reminiscent of an ascending island. The elaborate key that Miss Marple had discovered close to Morningside Cottage was tightly gripped. In her pocket, its elaborate pattern was a silent query. She planned to track down the Graysons because she believed they had answers to the death of Victor Langley. In the drawing room of the mansion, a vast room filled with thick draperies and pictures of grim-faced forebears, Mrs. Ella Lenana Grayson welcomed them. She offered tea, her pearl necklace glittering, her demeanor courteous but reserved. Rupert Grayson was lounging by the fireside, watching Miss Marple closely. Unspoken anxiety permeated the air, as though the mansion itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple remarked, "Thank you for receiving us, Mrs. Grayson," in a kind but incisive tone. "I've been really interested in the history of your family here. Isn't Grayson Manor a remarkable landmark?" Mrs. Grayson grinned tightly. "You know, Miss Marple, 5 generations. We have preserved the traditions of St. Mary's Hollow. Not like the guy from Langley with his contemporary views." Rupert's jaw tensed, but he remained silent as her tone oozed contempt. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea and observed the intricacies of the room. A picture on the fireplace, a worn tapestry of a hunt, and a closed case in the corner. A woman with a disturbingly similar face and a younger Mrs. Grayson. "You can see the influence of your family," she remarked. "However, I am aware that there was some conflict with Mr. Langley. Maybe a disagreement?" Rupert's tone was piercing. "He caused difficulty. Used those drawings of his to mock our name. Once, I came across a cartoon of this exact house with a figure skulking around. It's incredibly insulting." On her teacup, Mrs. Grayson's hand froze. "That's enough, Robert. Although we are saddened by Mr. Langley's passing, we are not concerned about it. Like him, we keep to ourselves." There was a slight glint in Miss Marple's eyes. She produced the elaborate key, holding it gingerly, albeit I'm curious as to why. "Located close to Morningside Cottage. Doesn't it look like it matches the locks here?" Rupert's chair scraped the floor as he stood suddenly, and Mrs. Grayson's face became pale. "Where did you purchase that?" He made a demand. "An ancient servant's key that was misplaced years ago. Has no meaning." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "But isn't it interesting? An estate key discovered close to a murder scene." She stopped, her eyes straying to the picture. "And this woman, Mrs. Grayson, who bore a remarkable likeness to a face in Mr. Langley's sketches, was a relative." Mrs. Grayson's mouth became thinner. "Margaret, my late cousin, left the village many years ago. A long-forgotten intimate matter." Her speech was clipped, yet her fingers twisted her, pearls displaying discomfort. With a calm smile, Miss Marple nodded. "How depressing. Don't broken relationships typically leave traces?" She thanked them for their kindness and got up, but her thoughts were racing. The key connected the manor and cottage, and Margaret's portrait matched the somber woman in Langley's sketches. She remembered the mysterious letter signed E. Ella Lenana, or another shadow from the Grayson past, and the red clay of the footprints that were plentiful close to the manor's quarry. "Jane, you've rattled them," Beatrice said as they departed. "Have you seen the face of Mrs. Grayson?" "I did," said Miss Marple quietly. "Beatrice, the Graysons have a legacy, but it's not all as proud as they say. This is a tale of love, treachery, and possibly retaliation, and I intend to reveal it." The lights of the house faded into the mist as the drizzle accompanied them back to Hafford Hall. Miss Marple pondered about the figure scratched out in Langley's sketch, the key, and Margaret. She felt that Morningside Cottage and Victor Langley's demise were directly connected to the tangled web of the Grayson heritage. Chapter 10. A risky admission. The village streets had become rivers of mud, and St. Mary's Hollow was battered by the resumption of the rain. Miss Jane Marple sat in Hafford Hall's comfortable library. As she considered the details of Victor Langley's murder, she could hear her knitting needles clicking softly. The mysterious letter signed E, the red clay footprint, the elaborate key, and the eerie drawings of a woman who looked like Mrs. Grayson's late cousin Margaret. The picture was still tantalizingly unfinished, but the pieces were starting to fit together. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Wet and shaking, with red eyes from crying, Lady Beatrice ushered Clarabelle in. Clara murmured, "Miss Marple," in a voice that broke. "I need to speak with you. It's about Victor." Aware of the seriousness, Beatrice excused herself, leaving Clara and Miss Marple by the fire. Clara's words came out as she gripped a handkerchief. "Miss Marple, I succeeded. Victor was killed by me. The guilt is getting to be too much for me." Although Miss Marple's brows raised a little, her face stayed composed. "That's a serious thing to say, my darling. Describe the event in detail." Clara's story came out quickly. She said to return a book since she had been to Morningside Cottage the night of the murder. Victor had been upset, complaining about sins and debts coming back to haunt him. They quarreled. Clara said that she had come to like him, but he had rejected her, claiming that his heart belonged to someone who was long since dead. She said that she had killed him by putting cyanide from his paint supplies into his tea while she was furious. Miss Marple paused her needles and listened. Despite the sincerity of the confession, something seemed off. Softly she said, "Clara, cyanide poisoning is quick. How did the vial break on the floor if you left him alive? What caused the door to be locked from the inside?" Clara stumbled, looking quickly out the window. "I'm not sure. I was angry. After I departed, he might have locked it." With a gentle yet firm tone, Miss Marple pressed for the key. The cottage's missing one was discovered close to the shrubs. Clara's handkerchief was twisted by her hands. "I didn't take any key. I promise." Leaning back, Miss Marple worked on her thoughts. Clara's confession was too neat and easy, and it didn't explain the shredded sketch or the red clay footprint. She had a suspicion that Clara was shielding herself or someone else from an unaffordable reality. "My darling," replied Miss Marple, "I believe you are bearing a weight that didn't belong to you. Do you think I'll uncover the truth?" With tears streaming down her face, Clara nodded and went to gather her thoughts. Seeing her chance, Miss Marple set up a deceptive trap. She suggested in a note to Constable Reed that he mention at the village bar that a witness had observed a woman wearing a distinctive scarf close to Morningside Cottage on the night of the murder. Miss Marple didn't have a witness like that, but she was curious about Clara's potential reaction because she knew she frequently wore a blue scarf. Beatrice invited the important participants to a little party she threw at Hafford Hall that evening. Robert, Mrs. Grayson, Mr. Petton, and Dr. Harrov. Tension was in the air as Reed, at Miss Marple's instigation, mentioned the scarf and the witness in passing. Dr. Harrov's face was pale, his fingers clenching his glass, and Mrs. Grayson's teacup clattered in its saucer. But the most telling was Robert. Muttering that he needed air, he stood up suddenly and walked out of the room. Robert talked quietly to his mother outside as Miss Marple lingered in the hallway. Hissing, "You said it was handled. We're in trouble if they're sniffing around about a scarf." Mrs. Grayson's response was incisive. "Robert, don't raise your voice. It isn't anything. Remain composed." Miss Marple pulled back, her heart pounding. She was uneasy, but the trap had also validated her suspicions regarding Clara's confession. The physical clues, the key, the clay, the sketches, and the girl's account didn't fit Grayson's anxiousness. The woman in Victor's drawings and someone connected to the Grayson legacy had also visited the cottage. Miss Marple went back to knitting as the storm roared outside, her thoughts connecting the dots. "A confession is only as true as the heart behind it," she whispered. Furthermore, I think Clara's heart is concealing more than it is revealing. Chapter 11. The last hint. The air in St. Mary's Hollow was still thick with expectation, even though the rain had subsided to a whisper, as though the town itself could feel its secrets being revealed. Miss Jane Marple sat in her Hafford Hall room, putting down her crocheting, and studied the case notes, the enigmatic letter signed E, and the elaborate key. The Graysons' uneasiness, Clara's questionable confession, the red clay footprint, and the missing sketch all suggested a secret in Victor Langley's background. However, one component was absent, and Miss Marple sensed it was near. With the grudging consent of Constable Reed, she went back to Morningside Cottage that morning, looking for what she had missed. She recalled the sketchbook with its torn page, the stormy canvas, and the scratched stool as the studio. However, a little dusty frame partially concealed under a pile of canvases caught her eye. When she carefully lifted it, she saw a faded portrait of a young woman with tears in her eyes, the same face as in Victor's sketches, the same look as Mrs. Grayson's cousin Margaret from the Grayson Manor photograph. A folded note, yellowed with age, was slipped behind the aged photograph, its edges crumpled as though it had been handled frequently. "My dearest Victor, I cannot stay," Miss Marple read, her heart pounding as she unfurled it. "They won't permit it." "Pardon me, M." The parts came together with a snap. Victor, Margaret, and the Graysons' resentment. It was a tale of secrets concealed and love spurned. With her mind racing, Miss Marple put the message and photograph into her pocket. The red clay, the key from Grayson Manor, and the note signed E.L. suggested a treachery that had smoldered for years. She went back to Hafford Hall and requested Lady B. Tatrick to invite Mrs. Grayson, Robert, Clara Bell, Dr. Harrive, and Mr. Petton to a party that night. "It's time to put this matter to rest, Beatrice," she stated in a composed yet determined tone. A roaring fire illuminated the drawing room, creating deep shadows on the faces of those present. Mrs. Grayson sat rigid, her pearls gleaming. Ruth's gaze flitted uneasily. Pale-faced, Clara gripped her shawl. Mr. Petton said a prayer to himself while Dr. the Harrive fidgeted with his cufflinks. Constable Reed stood by the door, his mustache twitching with curiosity. Miss Marple stood, her petite frame dominating the space. She said, "Thank you for coming," in a soft yet forceful voice. "We've all been troubled by Victor Langley's passing, and I think we can finally find the truth. Like so many tragedies, it starts with a love that was denied the opportunity to grow." She held it up and produced the faded photograph. Margaret, Mrs. Grayson's cousin, was in love with Victor Langley in Paris years ago. Perhaps under pressure from the Grayson family, who thought Victor was worthless, their engagement was called off rather than voluntarily. Mrs. Grayson's expression tensed, but she remained silent. Robert's hands clenched as he moved. Miss Marple went on. Perhaps in order to face the past, Victor traveled to St. Mary's Hollow, where Margaret's face was depicted in his sketches. However, this history was known to another person. This was written by someone. She displayed the E.L. Elena signed letter. She must be Mrs. Grayson. Mrs. Grayson's tone was cold and absurd. "I didn't write that." "Maybe," Miss Marple remarked, her eyes glimmering. "However, the red clay footprint from your quarry and the key discovered close to the cottage from your manor point to a link. Clara's confession, which was made to protect someone she cared about, was courageous yet untrue." Clara's eyes watered as she gasped. "I believed I was assisting." Miss Marple's eyes grew softer, then more intense as she looked at Dr. Harrive. "You treated Victor once, Doctor, but you were more knowledgeable than you admitted. Did you recognize Margaret from his sketches? Because when Margaret disappeared years ago, you were in Paris too." The color left Harrive's face. "I have no idea what you mean." "I believe you do," said Miss Marple. "And I believe you are aware of E's true identity. We'll see." She hesitated, allowing the room to be silent. The truth, like a photograph, develops with time. As the fire crackled and the rain murmured outside, Miss Marple knew the final revelation was near. The photograph, the note, and the gathered suspects would soon unmask the killer and the scandal that had led to Morningside Cottage's tragedy. Chapter 12. The truth is revealed. There was silence in Hafford Hall's drawing room. The fire's crackle and the soft patter of rain outside, the only sounds breaking the tension. Miss Jane Marple stood at the center, her small figure radiating quiet authority as she faced the gathered suspects. Mrs. Elenina Grayson, rigid with defiance. Rupert Grayson, his sharp features taut. Clara Bell, clutching her scarf with tearful eyes. Dr. Harold Hargrove, pale and fidgeting, and Mr. Petton, the vicar, his hands clasped in prayer. Constable Reed stood by the door, his notebook ready as Lady Beatrice watched with bated breath. Miss Marple held up the faded photograph of Margaret, its mournful eyes a silent accusation. Victor Langley's death, she began, her voice clear and steady, was not a random act, but the culmination of a betrayal that began years ago. This photograph found in his studio tells us of a love lost. Margaret, Mrs. Grayson's cousin, who loved Victor in Paris, but was torn from him. Mrs. Grayson's mouth clenched. That's old history, Miss Marple. It has no bearing on this. Oh, but it does, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. Victor came to St. Mary's Hollow, I believe, to confront that past. His sketches of Margaret, his caricature of Grayson Manor, they were not just art, but accusations, and someone feared what he might reveal. She produced the letter signed E, this letter addressed to Victor, warned that the truth will out. I suspected you, Mrs. Grayson, but the handwriting doesn't match. Nor does it belong to anyone here, except one who has been overlooked. The room stirred. Eyes darting. Miss Marple turned to Dr. Harrov. Doctor, you were in Paris when Margaret and Victor were together. You knew her, didn't you? And you loved her, too. Harrov's face crumpled, his voice a whisper. Yes, I loved her. But she chose Victor. I left Paris, tried to forget. Miss Marple nodded. But you couldn't. When Victor arrived here painting Margaret's face, you feared he'd expose the truth. That Margaret didn't leave willingly. She died, didn't she? And the Graysons, to protect their name, covered it up. Robert stood, his voice shaking. That's a lie. My family, sit down, Robert, Miss Marple said firmly. Your mother's cousin was shamed, sent away, and her death was no accident. Victor knew, and his sketches were a threat. But you, Doctor, had another reason. Jealousy. You poisoned Victor's tea with cyanide from your medical supplies, didn't you? Harrov's hands trembled. No, I couldn't. Miss Marple held up the ornate key. This key from Grayson Manor was found near the cottage. You took it, Doctor, to enter and stage the scene, locking the door to suggest suicide. The red clay footprint from the Manor's quarry betrayed you. And the torn sketch, Margaret's face scratched out, was your attempt to erase the past? Clara gasped. But I confessed, I thought I'd done it. In a moment of anger, Miss Marple's gaze softened. You loved Victor, Clara, and blamed yourself for his rejection. But your confession didn't fit. The shattered vial, the locked door. You were protecting someone, perhaps unknowingly. The true killer was Dr. Harrov. Harrov broke, his voice a sob. I saw her in his sketches every day, mocking me. He was going to tell everyone about Margaret, about the Graysons' lies. I couldn't let him ruin her memory. Mrs. Grayson's face was ashen. You fool, Harold. Margaret's death was an accident, a fall, nothing more. We sent her away to protect her, not to harm her. Miss Marple shook her head. Yet you hid it, Mrs. Grayson. And that secrecy drove Victor to his art and Dr. Hargrove to murder. The letter signed E was from Esther, a friend of Margaret's in Paris, who suspected the truth and wrote to warn Victor. Constable Reed stepped forward, his voice gruff. Dr. Harrov, you'll come with me. As Harrov was led away, the room exhaled. Clara wept quietly, and Rupert comforted his mother, whose pride had crumbled. Miss Marple folded the photograph, her heart heavy. "Love and envy," she said softly, "are powerful motives. But the truth, like rain, always finds a way to surface." The fire flickered, and the rain fell softly outside as St. Mary's Hollow began to heal from the secrets that had torn it apart. Epilogue to Chapter 13. The village becomes settled. Finally, the rain had stopped, and a timid autumn sunlight was shining on St. Mary's Hollow. With her knitting bag draped over her arm and her simple suitcase at her feet, Miss Jane Marple stood on the village station's platform. The community seemed to breathe easier now that the truth about Victor Langley's murder had been revealed, and the air was crisp, with a hint of moist dirt and dying leaves. However, Miss Marple was aware that no village was unaffected by such a scandal. Beside her, Lady Beatrice Hafford stood, her lavender silk scarf billowing in the wind. "You've done a miracle, Jane," she replied in a kind but sorrowful tone. "The Graysons' admission regarding Margaret and the arrest of Dr. Hargrove, we've been shook, but maybe we needed to be shaken." There was a slight glint in Miss Marple's eyes. Habituases in villages tend to conceal their injuries. Although it can hurt, exposing them promotes recovery. She looked up the hill at Morningside Cottage, its windows dark and empty. The truth was found for others by Victor Langley, who came here in search of it. Beatrice let out a sigh. "Clara Belle, poor thing. She blames herself for failing to see Victor's suffering, but she's stronger than she believes. To memorialize him, she intends to display his sketches, you know." Miss Marple nodded, her mind wandering to how Dr. Harrove's confession relieved Clara of her misplaced guilt, causing her to cry with relief. Even the Graysons had changed. Perhaps to make up for their family's quiet regarding Margaret's passing, Robert had mentioned repairing the manor's quarry to benefit the hamlet, and Mrs. Grayson's stern pride had loosened. Miss Marple adjusted her hat when the distant whistle of the train sounded. She remembered the letter-written E, the red clay footprint, the faded photo, and the elaborate key. Every thread in a tapestry of treachery, envy, and love. Although Dr. Harrove's trial was imminent, his admission of Margaret's terrible fall and the Graysons' cover-up had relieved some of the burden on St. Mary's Hollow. The letter had been used to track down Margaret's Parisian friend Esther, whose warning to Victor was a last act of loyalty. Porter Tom Bryce rushed to load her suitcase as the train arrived at the station. "You've done us a service, Miss Marple," he remarked, his apprehension giving way to appreciation. "Folks are discussing again. Not whispering, but proper-like." Miss Marple grinned. "The lifeblood of a village is conversation. Tom, you'll succeed if you remain kind." As a saint, she sat near the window and boarded the train. Mary's Hollow disappeared into the cloud of gold. She thought about the situation as her knitting needle started up again. A doctor ruined by jealousy, a broken vial, a closed room, and a love lost in Paris. "People are so very predictable, yet so very surprising," she whispered. She was carried back to St. Mary Me by the rattling train, where she was sure to find more mysteries. St. Mary's Hollow found its new rhythm behind her.